Sydney Donovan stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, as the dull hum of suburban life surrounded her. The early evening sun bathed the house in a soft glow, but there was a growing tension in the air. Her husband, Bob, sat at the kitchen table, a strange, almost manic energy crackling around him. His fingers drummed incessantly on the wooden surface, his eyes darting back and forth as if searching for the right moment to strike. Then he spoke, his voice sharp and emotionless. "Sydney, I want a divorce." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, followed by a deafening silence. Sydney froze, her heart skipping a beat. She slowly turned to face him, hands still wet, droplets of water falling onto the kitchen floor. "What?" she whispered, unsure if she had heard him correctly. Bob leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms smugly, as if her disbelief was an expected response. "I'm about to come into a significant sum of money, $7 million, to be exact. And, well, I don't want to share it with you." The casual cruelty in his voice left Sydney momentarily speechless. It wasn't the money, it was the admission that he'd been waiting for this moment to discard her, like an old coat he no longer needed. "You don't want to share it with me?" she asked, incredulous. He shrugged. "I only stayed with you this long because, let's face it, you were useful. You helped pay the bills, and your salary kept things running. But now, I don't need that. I don't need you anymore." For a moment, Sydney felt like she was falling through space, the ground giving way beneath her. The man she had spent years of her life with, the man she had loved and sacrificed for, had just told her that she was expendable. But then, something shifted inside her. A calm, cold clarity. This was her moment, her chance to escape from the emotional prison she'd lived in for years. "Fine," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm swirling inside her. "Let's do it. Let's get the divorce." Bob's eyes flickered with surprise, clearly expecting more of a fight. But Sydney had no tears left for him. "We'll sell the house," she continued, wiping her hands on a dish rag. "Use the money to pay off the mortgage, and we can both move on." Bob's smugness faltered for a moment as he studied her. Maybe he thought she would beg, cry, or rage. But Sydney wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. As she walked past him, she grabbed a pile of legal documents from the counter and slapped them down in front of him. It was time to start planning her new life, a life without Bob. In the days following Bob's bombshell, Sydney found herself reflecting on the slow, painful unraveling of their marriage. There had been a time when she thought they were happy, when they bought their modest home and spoke excitedly about the future. They had dreamed of having children, of building a family. But that dream had withered long ago. Bob had changed after their wedding. He became colder, more focused on money, and more distant from her in every possible way. His disdain for her job as a preschool teacher had been the first sign. "All you do is play with kids all day," he'd sneer. "While I'm out there working hard to keep this roof over our heads." Sydney loved her job, loved the children who looked up at her with wide, trusting eyes every day. But Bob couldn't see it. To him, her work was insignificant, just a distraction from what he saw as real life. His constant belittling chipped away at her self-worth, until she barely recognized herself in the mirror. They had been married for 8 years, and every time she brought up starting a family, Bob shot the idea down with a dismissive wave of his hand. "If you've got time to think about babies, you should be working harder," he'd say. "We have bills to pay, Sydney. We can't afford a child." She stopped asking after a while. What was the point? Bob didn't care about her dreams or their future together. All that mattered to him was money, money that never seemed to be enough, no matter how hard he worked. As Sydney replayed these memories, she realized that she had been emotionally abandoned long before Bob asked for a divorce. She had been living with a stranger, a man consumed by greed, who saw her as nothing more than a means to an end. But now that end had arrived. Sydney didn't waste time. She called a lawyer the next morning and started divorce proceedings. She was determined to cut Bob out of her life as quickly and cleanly as possible. But as the weeks went by, she began to notice things, small inconsistencies that didn't add up. Bob's claims about his $7 million inheritance were murky. He had been vague about where the money was coming from, brushing off her questions with condescending smiles. And his behavior was erratic, one moment gloating about his future, the next strangely preoccupied, as if he were hiding something. That's when Sydney decided to hire a private investigator. She had no intention of letting Bob walk away from their marriage with his lies intact. The investigator worked quickly, and it wasn't long before he uncovered the truth. Bob had been having an affair for months with a woman he claimed was a junior colleague. The photos were undeniable: Bob and his mistress entering a hotel, walking arm in arm, laughing together. Sydney's anger simmered beneath the surface, but she knew better than to confront him right away. She needed to be strategic. With the evidence in hand, she instructed her lawyer to prepare for the final blow. When the day came to finalize their divorce, Bob was cocky as ever. He strutted into the meeting, convinced that he held all the power. "Let's wrap this up," he said, smirking across the table. "I've got better things to do." Sydney remained calm, sliding a folder across the table. "Before we proceed, there's something I think you should see." Bob's face darkened as he opened the folder. His eyes scanned the photos inside, and his smirk vanished. Panic flickered across his features as he realized what she had. Those are fake," he stammered, his voice rising in desperation. "Anyone can Photoshop pictures these days." Sydney didn't even blink. "It's not just the photos, Bob. I have more than enough evidence. You've been lying to me for months, and now you'll pay for it." Her lawyer, seated beside her, leaned forward, offering a thin smile. "We're prepared to pursue alimony, given the circumstances. You've been unfaithful, and that changes everything." Bob looked cornered, his bravado crumbling before her eyes. For the first time in years, Sydney felt a sense of power, a power she had thought lost long ago. The day after their divorce was finalized, Bob showed up at Sydney's door. He looked disheveled, his face pale and drawn. There was no trace of the arrogant man who had demanded a divorce weeks earlier. Instead, he looked desperate, clinging to the last shred of hope. "Sydney, please," he begged, his voice trembling. "I need to talk to you." She opened the door just enough to face him, her expression cold. "What do you want, Bob?" I didn't actually inherit $7 million, he admitted, his eyes darting around nervously. "I thought I won the lottery, but I misread the numbers. I've got nothing, Sydney. No money, no job. I'm ruined." Sydney felt a flicker of shock. All this, his cruel decision to abandon her, the lies, the betrayal, had been based on a misunderstanding? She could hardly believe it. "I quit my job," Bob continued, wringing his hands. "I thought I didn't need it anymore. I told my boss off, burned every bridge. And now..." He looked up at her, tears brimming in his eyes. "Now I have nothing." For a moment, Sydney almost pitied him. But then she remembered the years of emotional abuse, the way he had demeaned her, belittled her dreams, and betrayed her trust. "You did this to yourself," she said, her voice hard. "I'm not your safety net anymore. You made your choices, Bob. Now you'll have to live with them." Bob's desperate gaze lingered on Sydney as she closed the door, shutting him out of her life once and for all. She leaned against the door for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the man who had once been her whole world, who had torn her down piece by piece, and now he stood broken. But as the weight of their final conversation settled, she felt something unexpected, a lightness, a sense of relief. For so long, she had been trapped in the shadow of Bob's cruelty, but now, that shadow had dissolved. There was no going back. The divorce was finalized, and Bob had nothing left to hold over her. Sydney had won her freedom, not through vengeance, but by reclaiming her dignity. She walked into the living room, where the sunlight streamed through the windows, bright and warm. The house felt different now, lighter, more peaceful. As she sat down, her thoughts turned to the future. The possibilities stretched out before her like an open road, and for the first time in years, Sydney felt in control of her own destiny. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, and she picked it up to see a message from her best friend, Abby. "Abby, dinner tomorrow? I want to hear everything." Sydney smiled. Abby had been her rock through the darkest times of her marriage, always there with a kind word or a much-needed distraction. She was one of the few people who knew the full extent of Bob's manipulation. Without her support, Sydney wasn't sure how she would have survived the past few years. "Sydney, absolutely. I could use some company." With that, Sydney felt a sense of calm wash over her. She no longer had to carry the weight of Bob's deception. She was free to rebuild her life, brick by brick, on her own terms. Bob's life unraveled faster than he could have imagined. After Sydney refused to take him back, his desperation grew. He was drowning in debt, having borrowed against a future that no longer existed. The once smug man who had bragged about his $7 million windfall now found himself penniless, alone, and spiraling out of control. His first real blow came when his boss, the one he had arrogantly quit on, refused to give him a second chance. Word of Bob's behavior had spread through the company, and there was no place for him anymore. The job market was unforgiving, especially for someone with his burned bridges. With no income and a mountain of bills piling up, Bob was forced to rely on his aging parents for financial support. They paid his mortgage to prevent foreclosure and sent him enough money to cover his basic expenses. It was humiliating. His parents, who had always been proud of his accomplishments, now regarded him with disappointment. They didn't understand how their once successful son had fallen so far. Worse still, Bob's injuries from a recent fall, an accident that seemed like a cruel twist of fate, landed him in the hospital for weeks. The medical bills only added to his growing debt, and the woman he had been having an affair with vanished from his life the moment his financial situation became clear. He was truly alone. As the days passed, Bob found himself replaying every decision he had made, every lie he had told, every opportunity he had squandered. He had been so focused on wealth and status that he had lost sight of everything that truly mattered. The irony wasn't lost on him. The $7 million he had bragged about had never existed, but it had cost him everything. Meanwhile, Sydney was thriving. After her divorce, she threw herself into her work at the preschool with renewed passion. She loved the children she taught, loved watching their curiosity blossom into excitement as they learned new things. Her work had always been a source of fulfillment, but now it was a lifeline, grounding her as she rebuilt her life. Sydney also started exploring new avenues outside of work. She had always been passionate about writing but had never had the time, or the emotional space, to pursue it seriously. Now, with the weight of her marriage lifted, she found herself sitting at her desk late into the night, typing away at her computer. Stories flowed from her fingers, stories about resilience, redemption, and the quiet strength that can be found in the most unexpected places. She even enrolled in a creative writing course at the local community center, where she met a group of like-minded people who encouraged and inspired her. It was a new chapter, not just in her personal life, but in her creative journey as well. Sydney felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. And then there was Abby. Over the months, their friendship deepened, their bond strengthened by the shared experiences of life's ups and downs. They spent weekends together, exploring new restaurants, taking trips to nearby towns, and simply enjoying the freedom that came with being in control of their own lives. One afternoon, as they sat together in a small cafe, Abby turned to Sydney with a mischievous smile. "You know," she said, stirring her coffee, "there's someone I think you should meet." Sydney raised an eyebrow. "Oh no, not this again." "I'm serious," Abby insisted, laughing. "He's a friend of my dad's. Well, he's a little older, but he's a good guy. Divorced, like you. And I think you'd really hit it off." Sydney shook her head, smiling despite herself. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." "You don't have to be ready for anything serious," Abby said. "Just meet him. He's nice. And honestly, it might be fun." Sydney took a deep breath, considering the idea. She hadn't thought about dating, not since her divorce. The scars from her marriage were still healing, and the thought of opening herself up to someone new was daunting. But she trusted Abby's judgment. Maybe it was time to take a small step forward, just to see what was out there. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll meet him." Abby beamed. "Great. I'll set it up." The weeks passed, and Bob's life continued its downward spiral. His debts mounted, and his parents grew increasingly frustrated with having to bail him out. One evening, after another terse phone call with his father, Bob stared at the empty bottle of painkillers on his kitchen counter. The physical pain from his injury had faded, but the emotional pain was constant, an ache that gnawed at him, a reminder of everything he had lost. He had ruined his marriage, burned his career, and alienated everyone who had once cared about him. The worst part was that he had no one to blame but himself. One night, as he lay on his threadbare couch, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Sydney. "I hope you find peace, Bob. I really do." The message was simple, but it cut through him like a knife. Sydney had moved on. She was free, living a life that was no longer shackled to his failures. He had been holding out hope that, somehow, she might still care for him, that she might offer him a way back. But her message made it clear, there was no going back. Bob deleted the message without replying. He didn't deserve her forgiveness, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Sydney's life continued to flourish. She met Abby's father's friend, a kind, thoughtful man named Jack, and while their first few meetings were casual, Sydney found herself drawn to him in a way she hadn't expected. Jack was patient, understanding, and had a quiet strength that was comforting after the chaos of her marriage. As the months passed, they grew closer, and Sydney realized that she could love again, not in the desperate, painful way she had loved Bob, but in a way that was steady and real. In the end, Sydney had found the truth, that her worth wasn't tied to someone else's validation, that she was strong enough to rebuild her life, and that the choices she made now would be hers alone. She had chosen freedom, and in doing so, she had found herself. Bob eventually moved out of the house and back in with his parents, where he would remain for several years, a shadow of the man he once was. Sydney, however, continued to thrive, her new relationship with Jack deepening with time. They took a trip to the mountains one fall, and as they stood at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the valley below, Sydney felt a sense of peace she had never known. She had survived the storm. And now, with Jack beside her and a future full of possibility, she was ready to embrace whatever came next. For the first time in years, Sydney was truly happy. If you liked this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.